Um, I'll be going through the training with you today. And I also have my colleague, Bridget, on the line. She's going to be helping us by keeping an eye on the chat and um, passing on any questions that anyone may have.
Whoa.
Hey, everybody.
Okay.
So this training.
Yeah, I have someone out there. What did you mute? Oh.
Yeah, it looks like we need everyone
Yeah.
on mute.
Oh.
Thank you.
Mm-hmm.
All right. So this training is for all properties that have agreements with the city to have rent and income restricted rental units at their property. Specifically, any properties where the agreements have provided city general funding. So if your property has funding from the city, federal funding from the city like HOME or CDBG or HOPWA, this may not be the best training for you because these requirements may differ from federally funded projects. Can everyone, Bridget, can you see my presentation? Is that coming through okay?
I'm not seeing it. I'm
No.
seeing your screen with all of us on it.
Oh. Let's try this again.
There we go.
All right. Okay. So some of the things that we'll be talking about today in this training is the property documentation, file documentation, calculating income, the income limits, utility allowances, rent limits, keeping your files audit ready at all times, reporting timelines, and then all of our contact information will be at the end. A few times throughout the training, I'll pause, see if there's any questions that have come up. As you think of questions, if you just want to put it in the chat, we'll try and get those answered for you immediately. If for some reason we don't know the answer immediately, we will get your email address, research it, and get an answer back to you within a day or two. So let's talk about documentation for the property as a whole. So as a property, you should have a tenant selection plan that addresses the affordable units are for low to moderate income households. Your tenant selection plan should talk about what your lease obligations are, what your waitlist policies are, what your policy is for rejected applicants, VAWA protections, violence against women, and any kind of occupancy standards or household changes. Affirmative fair housing marketing plan. Some of the things that your marketing plan should contain is how you're attracting eligible persons, what methods you're using to market, and method to annually assess the success of the affirmative marketing actions and corrections when the marketing requirements are not met. Some other policies and procedures you should have documented for your property, of course, is your recertification process policy, any kind of transfer plans that you allow at your property, and then your file maintenance and retention. How long are you keeping your files? What are you putting in your files? Like a lot of properties might have a checklist so they can keep all their files uniform and make sure all the correct documentation needed are in their files. Some important things to remember when we're talking about affordable rental units is that the allowable application fees may not exceed the actual cost of the credit and background check, and administrative fees for the application are not allowed for affordable units. Another really important thing to keep in mind, all non-optional fees must be deducted along with your property's utility allowance to make sure that you are charging the correct total rent amount. So if you have a unit, that's restricted to 80% income limits and 80% rent limits, that total amount needs to, I'm just going to throw out an example here, is $1,850. From that, you're going to back out your utility allowance, any kind of non-optional fees like rent insurance, rental insurance, something like that. And then the total that you get is what you can charge your tenant and tenant rent. So just something to keep in mind, and we'll go over that a little more later on in the presentation. So this next slide talks about the tenant file documentation. So we talked a little bit about the property overall, documentation, policies, procedures you should have in place. And now this is more on the tenant file side. So of course, the things that you want to have in your tenant file is, of course, the application signed and dated by all household members, valid government issued ID, your tenant consent and release form. And just in general, it's very, very important that all your documents in your tenant files are always signed and dated, by every adult in the household. Of course, you want to have a lease for 1 year, completed, signed, and dated, and make sure your lease does outline the tenant landlord obligations. Make sure your lease, or it can be an addendum as part of the lease, that you always have the affordable lease addendum attached, the VAWA lease addendum, violence against women, and then lead-based paint addendum if applicable. A few other things that your tenant file should always include is your calc worksheet with your calculator tapes of how you calculated that person's income, your utility allowance if it applies for your property, your income and asset verification. So a lot of properties might have sheets that they will fill out to also show how that they're calculating their assets. And then, of course, a lot of properties call it a TIC, tenant income certification form, or resident income certification form, filled out completely and in the file. So I guess we will pause right there and see if any questions, there are any questions that have come up yet?
Nothing in the chat as of now.
Okay. So we will move on. So with affordable housing, there are certain lease provisions that are, so let me rephrase that. So if your lease, if you have affordable rental units at your property, those affordable rental units cannot agree to the lease provisions listed on the screen. So they, and a lot of times this may be listed in your affordable lease addendum, but you're going to want to make sure that your leases do not conflict with these provisions. So a resident cannot agree not to be sued, or the property can keep possession of the resident's property as a rent payment, excusing the owner from responsibility, waiving notices, waiving legal proceedings or jury trials, termination of tenancy without good cause. So those are the things that you'll need to make sure that your lease contract doesn't conflict with, or that your affordable housing lease addendum supersedes the lease for these items. And then, of course, you would want to make sure that all of your residents are given the Denver tenant rights. should be provided by the landlord to tenants when the lease is signed and if a rent demand is ever served. This is an example of the VAWA lease addendum, Violence Against Women, went into effect back in 2013. You're going to want to make sure that every affordable unit has a copy of this lease addendum signed and dated in their tenant file. A little bit more information about the tenant file documentation. All households should be recertified annually, effective the first day of the move-in of the month or the initial certification month, whichever is applicable. So if you had somebody that moved in on 5/7, you know, their lease went for a year and you're going to recertify them again the following year on 5/1. So that's just an example. First day of the month. So when it comes to recertifications, of course, you should always have your recertification questionnaire completed, signed, and dated by all household members. You're going to want to have them sign again consent and release form for that year. You're going to recalculate their income using your income calculators, ticker tapes, things like that. Income and asset verification forms, and then, of course, your new RIC or TIC, resident income certification form. Before I go over this next part, just as a disclaimer, we want to say that if your property is layered with multiple different funding sources, then as a property, you're going to want to look at the requirements of each of those funding sources and make sure that you're using the most restrictive so you won't conflict. So for example, you know, if your property is city funded, with general city fundings, the restrictions are not as harsh as a federally funded project. So because of that, with city general funding, you can choose to do self-certs for residents that are there more than 2 years. So your initial certification and the first recertification a year later is a full cert with income and asset verifications and proper documentation. But the years after that can be a self-certification by the tenant. But we just want to make sure that you understand, while that's okay for our guidelines, you want to make sure that you look at all the different funding at your property to make sure that that doesn't conflict with other funding sources at your property. So something to keep in mind. So now let's look at some of the source documentation when it comes to income. You're going to want to request the last 2 months of pay stubs or a verification of employment form by the employer, right, to get an idea of what the income is. The pay stub should be consecutive and consistent and should be the most recent. When you have residents that have income from Social Security, pensions, military, VA, things like that, there should always be a current year's benefit award letter that you can request as the acceptable documentation. Child support, alimony, TANF, you should be able to get a 12-month printout from the payment agency. Residents that are self-employed, you should request the last 2 years of tax transcripts from the IRS. You can also request profit and loss statements if you need more detailed information. And then recurring contributions to the household. It could be, a family member could be giving a resident $100 a month to help with their, living costs. That is every month, and it's been going on for years. That's recurring contribution to the household. It's income coming in. So you should be able to get a letter documenting, who's giving it, for what, for how much, like that. And then something to keep in mind is your verifications should stay valid for 6 months from the date of the verification. And there's more information if you use this link down here at the bottom. This will take you out to HUD's website that goes into a lot more detail about documentation and calculations of income. So it could be a good resource for you. So now let's talk a little bit about assets. So we've talked about income, all sources of income should be included for all people living in the home, 18 and over. So now we're going to talk about assets. For your asset calculation, you're going to want the applicant or tenant to certify what kind of assets they have, checking account, savings account, stocks and bonds. For the purposes of this program, retirement accounts, college savings accounts are verified but do not have to be included. So just something to keep in mind. Those are exclusions from assets. So the resident certifies, self-certifies, I have a checking account, I have a savings account. And then if it's $5,000 or less, you do not have to include any of that income in the total annual household income. But if all the combined assets are greater than $5,000, then you would move forward to the next step using the HUD passbook rate, doing the math, doing the calculation, and then adding that total to the annual household income. The passbook rate has recently changed. Effective this year, it went up to 0.40%. We will publish on our website new rent and income limit tables annually. It's based on when HUD publishes their tables. Last year, I think the tables were published in June and they went into effect June 15th last year. So far in 2024, nothing has been published yet, but it will probably be coming up here within the next couple months. Don't forget, all income limits are based on household size. Okay, I think we can pause there for a second and see if there's anybody that has any questions so far. Nothing, Bridget?
Nope, the chat is still clear.
I have one question, actually.
Yeah.
So, for our properties, we do not charge any kind of utilities. So is that for kind of documenting that utility allowance? Is it essentially just saying, or are you about to go over that?
We're gonna go over it.
Okay.
But let's see. So for example, if I looked at your lease contract and it showed me that all utilities were included in the rent price, Denise, correct me if I'm wrong, but that means they do not technically have to have this on file if all utilities are already included in the rent price. Does that sound
is
right?
correct.
Okay. Okay.
So you will not have a utility allowance schedule in the file, and you don't have to complete this form.
Okay, great. Thank you so much.
Yeah. So, it's a big mixture right now. We have, a good chunk of properties that include all utilities in the rent, so they won't have one of these, but we have at least half that, you know, the resident does have to pay their own gas and electric or something like that. And when that's the case, that is when we would require your property to have a utility allowance on file. So we know when we're checking your annual compliance, you know, what your utility allowance should be. Of course, those numbers have to be backed out of your the total rent limit. So we know that those residents and those affordable units are being charged the correct rent amount. If you want a copy of these forms, you know, we have them, we can send them to you. Just shoot us a note, shoot us a message. We'll send them over to you. But, you know, there's lots of different options on what your property can use as a utility allowance schedule. DOLA has one, Section 8 has one. There's a HUD utility model. So our form just basically goes through all the different options that you might want to pick and use. You just need to document that's what your property is using, and then you're going to want to document that in your resident files.
We did have one question come in, Leah.
Okay.
So are pay stubs considered acceptable third-party verification of income? We don't need the employer to fill out a form verifying.
That is correct. So if you are collecting the last 2 months of pay stubs, that is verification. You can if for some reason pay stubs are proving really hard to get, you could technically also get the employer to fill out a verification of employment form, as long as they put, like, you know, the year-to-date income on it as well for you. So it could be one or the other, but it doesn't have to be both. But yes, that would be third-party verified. So now what are we on? So since the rent and income limit tables are published annually, some things you want to keep in mind with the tables and their published dates. If you have a tenant on month-to-month lease, the tenant must be given a minimum of 60 days notice before a rent increase can be effective. If a tenant is within a lease period, the rent can only be increased at the lease renewal time and only once in a 12-month period. And when the new rent and income limit tables are released, the property can have 60 days to implement those rates. So this is an example. You know, we talked a few slides back about properties having utility allowances or properties having non-optional fees that the residents are required to pay that they cannot opt out of. So those things need to be figured into your total tenant rent amount that you're charging. So this slide is just kind of an example of how we look at that. So let's say you have 10 units at your property that are rent and income restricted. The restrictions on those units say that the tenant has to be at 80% AMI and can be charged no more than the 80% rent limit. So that means an 80% rent limit for a one-bedroom apartment is $1,862. But residents are charged utilities or have to pay for their own utilities, but directly to a service provider. And your property also has a non-optional fee of rent insurance. So we go through our utility allowance schedule and we figure the correct amount of the utility allowance for that one-bedroom apartment, and we get a total of $146. So you have the 80% rent limit of $1,862 minus the utility allowance of $146 minus the non-optional fees at your community of $15 for rent insurance. So that means I can only charge the tenant $1,701. Or if I charge them any more than that, then that unit would be out of compliance on the rent limit. So does that kind of
Leah?
make sense? Yes.
So question came in, can we charge month-to-month fees?
Um,
So the month-to-month fees are not allowed if it's going to take that resident over that maximum rent limit.
so correct me if I'm wrong, Denise. Because it's an affordable unit, if the tenant, let's say the tenant goes through a 1-year lease, so even if the tenant doesn't sign a new lease and goes month to month, it doesn't change that that unit is a rent restricted unit and still has to stay within that guideline.
Correct.
that
They
correct?
still have to be under the max rent. So even if they
Okay.
charge the month to month, it still can't exceed the max rent.
Correct. Okay.
hmm
Got it. Does did that answer their question?
Yes, that's perfect.
Okay. All right. Um, okay. So also the for our program, the City and County of Denver's affordable rental program, we always have the next available rule for all property, well, for properties that are city funded. Of course, the resident must income qualify at move-in. But let's say, 1 or 2 years down the road and their income and, they got a raise or they got a better job and they're making more money now. Well, um, can be floating units. So, if you have 120 units at your property, 10 of them are affordable units restricted with the city. You can always swap in one for another. But you followed the next available unit rule to make sure that you're always in compliance with the agreement. So you always have your 10 units that are restricted. The next available must be like, so if it's a 1-bedroom that falls out of compliance, you want to make sure the next available 1-bedroom is rented to somebody in compliance with the rent and income limit. The affordable unit can be transferred to an existing resident. That income qualifies for the affordable unit. To transfer the affordability, to complete a full certification, sign new lease paperwork, and the affordable housing lease addendum. Something that could help your property, and we know we have tons of properties that are also tax credit properties, LIHTC. LIHTC has rules that allow income to up to 140% of the current income limit. So that could also help you, and that means you wouldn't have to worry about finding another unit that's available. Technically, as long as that unit stays within 140% of the current income limit, then technically that unit is not out of compliance. But again, that's if your property is also LIHTC. All right, so how do you keep your files audit ready at all times? These are just some examples of, common errors that we see when we're going through files. So these are things that keep in mind and make sure that your files are in compliance with these items. You should have no problems whenever it's time for us to come around and do the file audits at your property. Don't forget that all your documents should always be signed and dated by every adult household member. If the documentation in the file should tell the story of what's happening and why. If for some reason they don't, that's what clarification records are for, right? You can complete a clarification record because a document may not say everything. Maybe you had a conversation with an employer to clarify something that you would put on a clarification record and add it to the file. So if someone's coming behind you and trying to understand the whole story here and why we did what we did, that clarification record will tell the story. You want to make sure all your documents are always filled in, even if it means writing NA on every line. But all the boxes are checked, all the lines are filled out, all the documents are signed and dated. Double check your calculations, double check your income calculations, make sure that you're factoring everything in properly, your passbook rates, your asset calculations with your passbook rates, and just double and triple check that you're charging the right amount of rent to your tenant. Make sure that if it applies to your property, make sure that you've backed out your utility allowance. Make sure you've backed out any non-optional fees because those are always added to what you're charging the tenant, and that must be within the correct limit for the restrictions on your property. Lease addendums are a big thing. You're going to want to make sure that you always have all the correct lease addendums in your file, signed and dated. Your VAWA, your affordable housing lease addendum, those are two really important things. Your resident income certifications, your RICs or your TICs, your questionnaires. Make sure that those are always in the file for each year, signed and dated. The correct rent and income limits are notated on the RIC or TIC. And verification. So all your income sources have been verified with your pay stubs or your award letters or a verification of employment, your asset verifications. Again, don't forget, under 5,000, you don't have to count it. Over 5,000, you do the calculation with the passbook rate. And then just make sure you're checking things are dated appropriately for the year of the recertification that you're doing. You don't want to use, something that's a year old to do the recertification this year. So just make sure you're getting all your correct documentation in place. And then don't forget to always include your calculation worksheets, what you're using to calculate it, and your ticker tapes. So all communities that have an agreement with the City and County of Denver for rent restricted and income restricted units, we encourage them to always post their openings, available units on coloradohousingsearch.com. Whenever we get questions from the general public, this is where we send them to. And then let's see, other marketing sources and ideas. Of course, you're welcome to use whatever resources you have available to you. But, Craigslist, Facebook Marketplace, and local Denver Housing Authority, might be able to work with you on matching people up with units, people in their programs. Local businesses might have preferred employer programs with targeted income groups. Local community centers, any kind of local agencies that help certain demographics in your area could be great organizations to partner with and work with. But those are just some general ideas. So we wanted to kind of give everyone a general idea of what the reporting looks like when you're working with the City and County of Denver. So our compliance team, we do have to request your annual rental unit compliance yearly. That is where the property goes onto our portal and inputs data for each individual restricted unit that the property has. name, household size, income, last time they were certified, things like that. And so that's annually. I would say October. Usually it's going to be September, October, where we start doing our mass emails to all of our partners, letting them know it's time. It's coming up. We always offer training before it's due to make sure we can refresh everyone about how to use our portal. And then the second piece is the file audits that we have recently started. Our file audits, our plan is to do a file audit at the property within 1 year after lease up, and then up to every 3 years after that.
We have one quick question, Leah. Are we required to list on Colorado Housing Search or just encouraged?
Encouraged. We would love for you to, and we ask it of every property that we partner with and have an agreement with. But no one is going to go behind you and check and make sure it's done. But we would love it if you could, because it's a really good tool for the general public to use. Denise,
Yeah,
you
can
got
I add
something?
something?
Yeah.
Do not forget that you have an affirmative fair housing marketing plan as well that was completed for your property when you first were awarded money through our agency. And you need to make sure you're also doing your advertising to those agencies identified on that plan every year. So on top of us encouraging you to use the ColoradoHousingSearch.com, also use those other agency and that other marketing you're supposed to use. Because when we audit your property, we'll be looking at that as well.
All right, very good point. We talked about reporting. Just some general things to keep in mind. If for some reason, when we do our annual reporting or the file audits, if we're noticing things that are out of compliance, we may need to work with you a little more frequently just to make sure that, we get everything back in compliance at your property. You know, depending on what items or findings there are, we may need to come to your property and continue working with you. So just some things to keep in mind. And this is just, our entire team, our asset management and compliance team. Contacts if you ever need to get a hold of us. It's all there for you. And that is the end of our presentation. Has anyone else thought of any other questions along the way that we can help answer? Well, I hope this is helpful for you. If you have any feedback at all about maybe items, questions that this training did not address, we're absolutely always wanting that type of feedback so we can make changes that is, more helpful to our partners. Harry is asking if the slides are available somewhere. We plan to post this on our compliance website. Hey, Bridget, can you put the link
Yes.
to our
In the chat.
in the chat. So we have a rental compliance resources webpage. It's part of the City and County Denver's mass, websites, but available to all of our partners where we will be posting trainings, notices we send out. We post it there too in case anyone didn't get it. They can go back and look at old ones. But yeah, all of our training and PowerPoints and notices are on that resource webpage for you guys. And Bridget will put the link in the chat.
We have another question also while I'm looking for this. If we are 100% affordable, how do we handle tenants that are over the income limit at recertification? Great question.
Yeah, it's technically your property would still technically use the next available unit rule, right? Just the next time a unit becomes available. Does it mean that that unit stays out of compliance? Yes, it does. But as long as we know that they were certified, they qualified at move-in, right? And now a year or two down the road, they're making a little bit more money. Yes, technically that unit does stay out of compliance, but we're not going to be asking you to do anything special, knowing that you're just going to use your next available unit rule. The next time there's a unit available at the property, it's going to go to an income certified person, right? Was that the last question?
Yep.
Denise has something. Denise, go ahead.
Sorry, I just wanted to add one small thing to that.
Okay.
For that unit that is over income, we'll be looking for, once that tenant moves out, that the next person going into that unit is actually income qualified. So that will be something that will be on our radar for when we're looking at an audit of your project.
All right. Sounds good. Well, then I guess that's it for today. Thank you, everyone, for joining, and we hope you all have a wonderful rest of your day. Bye.
Bye.
Thank you so much, Leah.
You're welcome.